Today's show is sponsored by CloudZero. For software-driven companies focused on growing margins, CloudZero is the only cloud cost intelligence platform that puts engineering in control by connecting technical decisions to business results. By analyzing cloud services like AWS and Snowflake, CloudZero provides real-time cost insights that help you maximize margins. Engineering teams can answer critical questions like, who are my most expensive customers? How much does this specific feature cost our business? What's the cost impact of re-architecting this application? With cost anomaly alerts via Slack, product-specific data views, and granular engineering context that makes it easy to investigate any cost, CloudZero is your complete cloud cost intelligence platform, connecting the dots between high-level trends and individual line items. Join companies like Drift, Rapid7, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Another Sunday Perspective show, and if you're listening to this as a regular listener, kind of a when the show comes out listener, you're probably listening to this the week of KubeCon North America up in Detroit. If you're traveling to KubeCon, we'd love to if you see Aaron and I, come by, say hi. Love to meet folks in person. Gosh, it's been so long since we've been at an event. So we'll be heading out to KubeCon. I'm heading out Sunday. I'll be up there Sunday through Thursday. So hopefully I get a chance to meet some folks in person. Today I want to talk about something that we covered early in the year as a kind of a look ahead, as a trend that was happening. And then I saw kind of a buzz that happened a little bit on the Twitters and in the technology world, and that is SuperClouds. We talked with our friend Dave Vellante about SuperClouds earlier in the year. Their organization, Wikibon, who's also part of Silicon Angle Media, Silicon Angle Media, who also runs theCUBE and all those good things, had an event over the summer talking about SuperCloud, and kind of a lot of blowback about it. And I thought, well, let's dig into it a little bit. Let's dig into what some of the complaints are, and what's been going on with it, because Dave and the team has been working very hard to sort of try and suss out what they think is a new idea. And I think there is a lot of merit to the idea. Dave's somebody who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. If you don't know Dave, Dave's somebody who's been around the industry for quite a while, and for all the sort of hype that happens in our industry and people who maybe aren't qualified to talk about a lot of things, or sort of want to make big proclamations without any real data. Dave's somebody who, is a sort of a data-centric person at heart, and, has been really trying to build a concept around this, and not sort of just build it from scratch, but because there are a bunch of real examples of this concept that he calls SuperCloud, or Wikibon calls SuperCloud. But I think there's some interesting discussions to have around it. I think, there's some nuance in there that maybe kind of get lost in the naming of things. And so I thought what I would do in today's Sunday Perspective is kind of dig a little bit deeper into, kind of this evolution of what is or isn't SuperCloud. I'm going to do that after the break. Buffering. How annoying. Did you know that 17 out of 20 people stop watching a video because of stalling and rebuffering? Don't let your users click away to a competitor's site. If your business lies in online media, rely on CDN77 to deliver a seamless online experience to your audience. CDN77 is one of the leading global providers of content delivery network services. They power the world's most popular websites and apps, such as Udemy, ESL Gaming, live sports TV, and social media platforms. Aside from their massive and redundant global network, you're going to love their no BS attitude and skilled team of engineers ready to help 24/7. No chatbots, no tickets bouncing around unresolved for days, just people who know your use case and can immediately help you pinpoint and fix the problems. Don't wait until your users run out of patience. Go to cdn77.com/cloudcast and ask for a free trial with no duration or traffic limits. That's cdn77.com/cloudcast. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're gonna kind of dive into this concept of SuperCloud. And if you listen to the show on a regular basis, you probably heard Dave Vellante come on one of our January look ahead to 2022 shows. We talked about this concept of SuperCloud. And, if you think about it, where Dave's been going with this is, and again, he's been the first to sort of highlight, like the name may be appropriate. The name may be a placeholder. He's not really hung up on the name, But it's this idea of, what happens when companies, businesses start saying, hey, yes, I'm going to use the cloud, and maybe it's private and public, but in a lot of cases it's public cloud. But they look at the cloud and they go, maybe years ago they originally thought of the cloud as, hey, it's an extension of my data center, or I'm going to treat it like another data center in terms of, in the past, if you went to Rackspace or if you went to some colo provider, Equinix or something like that, you kind of treated them somewhat neutrally, right? You said, yes, I'm going to have a business relationship with that thing that hosts my applications, that runs my servers, that, manages network traffic. But for the most part, it was kind of a neutral thing, right? Like, yes, you had a relationship with them, and yes, they may have had a marketing slogan or whatever it might have been, but they weren't a sort of super massive global entity that also had a bunch of other things tied to that business, right? So if you think about AWS, Amazon has a lot of tentacles tied to the entire Amazon business. It's wrapped up in a lot of stuff that's technology, but also gets into sort of politics and all sorts of other stuff. If you think about Microsoft, Microsoft is probably the most technology-centric, IT-centric of them, and we've talked about this a lot on the show in the past. But there are still aspects of Microsoft that may be uncompelling to you. Maybe you look at some of the stuff that happened with SolarWinds, or you look at the work that they do. Maybe you're not happy with how they protested stuff with some of these government contracts or whatever it might be, right? There's more to Microsoft than just sort of like, hey, they're my Windows vendor, right? When they become a cloud, a lot more happens. Same thing with Google, right? Google, obviously there's Google Cloud, which is growing and evolving and kind of trying to figure out its place in the world. But at the same time, then there's Google, and then there's the things that Google does that in some cases, maybe you don't love that they cancel products from time to time. Maybe you are concerned that in other parts of the world, like the EU or other places, like they're facing legal battles over competitive behavior in search or something like that, right? So it's your relationship with the major cloud providers, especially if it's the big three, and maybe it's clouds in various regions of the world or whatever it might be. You look at those and you're like, okay, this is I have to consider exterior things, ulterior things, like things more than just sort of the neutrality that I used to have with a colo provider. And again, that may not worry you. You may not care. You may just go, look, as long as they provide great compute services or database services, I really don't care. I don't get into politics. My job is to, help our business do whatever it is. And that's perfectly fine. But there are a set of companies who do have to take that into consideration, right? They may actually have to be concerned that maybe someday, let's say you're in the automotive industry, or you're in the transportation industry, or you're in the retail industry or groceries or something, you go, one of these folks may end up being a competitor to me on some level. And maybe that concerns you, right? So I think early on and over time, kind of the view of the cloud has evolved. It's gone from, hey, it's another place to run my applications. Yes, maybe it has these cool characteristics of agility and pricing on a more granular basis, or, what seems like infinite scale, all sorts of really powerful things from a technology perspective. But there's also sometimes there's more to it, as I kind of highlighted and ranted on the last couple of minutes. So I think what comes out of that is you start getting companies who think about, okay, we're going to work with the cloud. And a couple of things have happened, right? In some cases, they are kind of the central IT entity, the sort of central technology group within an organization. And they say, hey, the same way that we think about multiple vendors that we have, that we want to sort of have some neutrality with our vendors, they've thought, hey, maybe I want to have some neutrality with my cloud providers. Okay, that's fair. It's a viable thing. It's a little more difficult with the cloud providers because of the way they do pricing and so on and so forth, but it's a valid concern. In other cases, we see companies who they'll say, hey, look, our central IT group has made certain decisions about how we're going to engage with the cloud, but our data science group uses a different cloud. Our other group that does development for this, certain things that we do, they use another cloud. And you end up figuring out that like their version of multi-cloud is really kind of departmental, or in some cases on an application by application basis. So they really just treat the clouds as just, silos like they would have done if you'd gone back 10 years or 15 years and they go, oh, well, that part over there in the data center, that's all our SAP stuff. It runs our ERP system. And that stuff over there, that's all our Oracle applications. It manages our like order tracking or how we do, payroll or whatever it is. So we used to have this concept of sort of siloed stuff within data centers. Now they just sort of extend out to the cloud. And so I think, as I think about, this concept of SuperCloud, there's a couple of pieces of it that are sort of interesting, right? There is again the idea of, is this idea of SuperCloud, is it really just sort of a renaming of this abstraction, some sort of abstraction technology that allows me to say, hey, I'd like to, as much as possible, make the clouds seem as consistent as I possibly can. And there's some technologies that maybe can help with that. So, maybe you're doing just something as simple as saying, hey, we run VMware on premises, and we're going to take advantage of these like managed VMware services in the cloud. And so to a certain extent, as far as you're concerned, you just see VMware. And so, in theory, you could go, well, we've sort of built a abstracted layer using the exact same technologies to do that. Okay, fine. You may end up saying, well, we'd like to, use sort of an industry standard, maybe an open standard, as opposed to maybe something like VMware to go about doing that. And so we've had, lots of discussions about, hey, is that maybe that open standard is something like Kubernetes, in which you can maybe run, on premises, you can run Kubernetes. In the cloud, you can run Kubernetes. Maybe on premises, you run it yourself. And in the cloud, you use a managed service or of some sort. Like, that's another way of saying like, hey, to a certain extent, I'm providing an abstraction that for some part of my technology stack could be, consistent. Now, for a while, we've called that sort of stuff like hybrid cloud or multi-cloud. So there's sometimes some confusion of like, oh, is this super cloud concept? Is it just, kind of trying to replace or rename or remarket or rebrand hybrid cloud or multi-cloud because that's become confusing, or it's maybe hasn't proven out to be exactly what everybody thought it was going to be, whatever. Maybe, right? But I think the third way to look at this is there are a set of applications, a set of services. And this is where I think the naming piece kind of does it a disservice in that, just like we had with serverless, so we spent some time when people said, hey, like this concept of serverless is out there, and there was a set of people who grasped onto the technology and said, oh, this is really powerful. This could be really interesting in how I build my applications, how much less operations I have to do, how it can be really granular in terms of pricing and really the power of it. And then there's still an ongoing set of people who are like, oh, but serverless has servers under the covers and that's a terrible name and blah, 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 blah. So I think to a certain extent that this super cloud naming might be holding back some people and sort of thinking about what this means. The way I look at it, and again, I think the other problem with this is when you come out with something that has this bold name like SuperCloud, again, people go, well, okay, let's break that down. Cloud in our world today tends to be these gigantic entities, an Azure or AWS or a Google Cloud. So there's a certain perception of like, oh, this thing's gonna be pretty big, and then you throw the word super on there. And, again, just because of the adjective itself, it tends to be like, oh, it's not only big, but it's really something, it's something powerful, something important, whatever. And I think as I think about it, and especially as you dig into sort of what some of the examples of this thing are, the examples are really more application layer, right? Or I don't want to say application layer. They're services that you can consume as part of an application. And so maybe the first thing to think about in this sort of super cloud concept is maybe the thing really should be more like super service or super app, right? As opposed to super cloud, because cloud tends to, again, connotate this idea as sort of all encompassing of compute, storage, networking, applications, database, data, blah, blah, blah. So I think there's a certain part of it that like it probably needs to get narrowed, and super might be a fine adjective with it or qualifier, but I think it's maybe super service or super application. And once you sort of get to that point, then you can start to have the thought process of like, well, what does this thing mean? And what I think the thing is, the super thing, I'll call it super service, is this idea of something like Snowflake or what MongoDB is doing with Atlas, or there's a number of examples out there in which it's in many cases, it's a data service. There's not a whole lot of like application level services, purely application level without the data in the back end that you'd kind of fit into this thing. The application level stuff tends to just be like, yes, it's available all over the place. You don't really have to care which cloud or where it is, because essentially whether it's like load balancing or DNS or CDN services, they sort of take care of the things that would be sort of the front end of applications. But on the back end, where you're going, hey, I want to consume a bunch of data. I want to have a bunch of data. I want to consume a bunch of data. I want to be able to make sure that data is fairly close to the things that want to access it, i.e. clients and applications and so forth. This is where you sort of get into these super services, right? So something like a Snowflake or MongoDB Atlas, or there's a whole bunch that are in the 3.0 definition of SuperCloud. And so I think what's really interesting about that is if you think about most people that use the cloud, most businesses that use the cloud, like they still struggle with this idea of, how do I make them multi-AZ? I mean, they still struggle to make them multi-AZ, and that's getting somewhat better, right? But to make them multi-region, or to make them, multi, data center, or whatever the cloud provider calls sort of like different places, that part's hard. And that's the stuff that I think is sort of interesting to think about, because what folks like Snowflake and some others have done is they've said, just give us your data and maybe tell us the cloud that it has to be in. But if you at some point in time decide, hey, I want to expand that into something else. I want to expand that either into another region or into another cloud, or I want to drop one of the clouds because, like I said, you've got some reason to not want to work with that cloud, be it technical or political or competitive or whatever it might be. They essentially sort of hide all that complexity for you. And I think that concept in and of itself is really powerful. I think at the crux of it, that's probably what this discussion should be. This sort of super service discussion should be, it's probably a data-centric service, which, most of the examples that are listed are data-centric service. B, I want to be able to start anywhere, and I want to just be able to say like, oh yeah, add something else to it without me really having to worry about how do you do that. Nothing changes for me. I don't have to write to a new API. I don't have to think about data movement. Maybe my applications don't even have to think about data movement. They still maybe point to the same DNS record or the same API or whatever it might be. That I think is really powerful, because I think, if we think about sort of computing in the way that we have this taxonomy of computing, we have things like, well, it's a computing resource, and we think of it as like sort of an IaaS sort of resource where you go, it's the application and, and the computing underneath it, and you sort of take care of the application. And then we get into things like, oh, it's more of a PaaS service, right? It's you write the application and a whole bunch of stuff under the cover is taken care of for you. Or it's a SaaS service where you just go like, I just consume the application. I think, I think this sort of super service could fit into that sort of as a service dichotomy. If we were to think about it as A, it's probably a data service, and B, it's something that, the architecture, the concept of how you start somewhere, add stuff, remove stuff, doesn't ever really change your perspective from an application perspective or even an admin perspective on how to manage that thing, how to interact with that thing. And I think that's the interesting thing. That's the thing I think if you really boiled it down and said like, hey, what would I like to learn from somebody like a Snowflake or a MongoDB Atlas or any of the other examples is like, how are you doing that? Because I think in general, most companies, can't figure that out. They don't have enough time and resources to think about it because it's not really their core business. Whereas, some of these services are their core businesses, and how to do that is interesting. But I think of it the same way that, like years ago when it was, whether it's Adrian Cockcroft or the Netflix engineering team or whatever was saying like, hey, we introduced this concept of like chaos, chaos into what we do, like organized chaos, which is now, as we talked about a week or two ago, like chaos engineering, or any of these sort of things. Like they talked about how they did it. And again, not everybody can adopt that, and not everybody necessarily can afford to sort of be doing that. In some cases, maybe you'd argue you can't afford not to do it, but to have the skill set, to have the tooling, maybe you can, maybe you can't. But I think, seeing that evolve the same way that we've seen, PaaS and SaaS and serverless and how it works and debating the technical nuances and, is one implementation of it better than another? I think there's an opportunity in this sort of super service concept to have discussions about that. Because I think if you're a corporation and you are a, multi-region corporation, you're a business that has to be concerned about, what your relationship with the cloud provider is going to be, or, you think about maybe geopolitical things and you go like, okay, well, I have certain things in certain places of the world, but certain places of the world have more volatility than other places of the world, or you just say, well, look, forget about sort of pre-thinking about where you might have more challenges than others. Challenges are just going to happen, right? Like you think about the world in terms of chaos engineering, which, we tend to do it from an IT perspective. We go like, oh, if a backhoe takes out a fiber thing, like what if we lose a data center? Well, what if you lose a data center, but not for like a few hours or a few days, but like forever, right? So I think there's a lot of value in thinking about and better understanding how some of these things are done, because I think we're going to see more and more companies who say like, I like the concept of what, Mongo or Snowflake or whatever. And I apologize. I should have looked up all the other ones. So I apologize for keep coming back to the same examples. There's a dozen or so that Dave highlights in there. But I think you're going to see more and more people going like, hey, why aren't more services like that? Why aren't, and they could be data services. They could be some other types of services. It could be event-based stuff, but data services is probably the most common one. That I think is probably the most interesting discussion. I think this discussion of like, is the name right or not? It doesn't interest me. And maybe Dave will listen to this and go, oh, really? I should adjust the name. Because I don't think he's hung up on it from a marketing perspective. I think he's just trying to convey a concept. But I think the more I think about the concept, I think if you could kind of narrow the name and sort of think of it in terms of like, it's not this super, it's the new PaaS plus IaaS plus SaaS plus abstraction layer, and really think of it as like, it's a certain kind of service that appeals to a set of customers who have distinct problems that are well known. Like, how do those things work? And are these things that our industry should better understand in terms of how to architect something? And could people architect it? Sure. But having more people that have actually done it, talking about it, I think would be really, really interesting. Again, it's not always about like, hey, can enough people learn this stuff? It's like, hey, as an industry or as a collaborative or as a community, can you help accelerate learning curves? That's the part that becomes valuable in our industry. Not can everybody start from scratch or could everybody write a book about it? It's, can you collectively help the next person 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, learn from your mistakes, learn from what you learned, help them think about like, okay, if you're starting now, even though somebody else started 5 years ago, what can you build from? What sort of, how can you stand on the shoulder of the previous giants of that? So anyways, as I've been thinking about this thing, I think if you're reading this stuff and you're hung up on the name or whatever, fine, so be it. There's still people that get hung up that the VM and VMware is capitalized wrong, or that on-premise versus on-premises is they want to become the grammar police or whatever it is. So be it. If that's your thing, so be it. But I do think there is something here in that we're not just talking about made up stuff, right? We're not talking about like, I'll give you an example. There was a thing back in the old VMware days where we would talk about vMotion. And then there was like long distance vMotion, and people would talk about examples of like, you're going to move your application around the world and follow the sun and all sorts of stuff. And it's like, nah, that never really panned out. But if you did have a thing where it was like, we have a pretty universal way to, look at data and think about data and be able to deal with it on a global basis, that's a pretty interesting problem to solve. And if it now becomes just a service, that becomes an even more interesting thing as part of your toolbox. I think that's kind of where we are. So if you're following that discussion at all, I would sort of posture this alternative framing. I think there is a lot to be figured out there. If you can find a way to get yourself past the naming of it or the hang up of maybe exactly how it's framed right now, I think it's a space that will evolve. But I think it's a space that, just like, a lot of people learn from the different ways that people like Netflix, early on built chaos engineering or built, the Netflix OSS thing, which eventually kind of was part of Spring and is kind of still part of Spring, or, one learned from the other. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that can come out of that. So anyways, just my 2 cents, something to think about. Maybe if you're going to KubeCon, or just, if this sort of space is interesting to you, I'd love to get some feedback. Or more importantly, if you're listening to this and you go like, oh, man, I didn't know there was this discussion going on, give Dave some feedback, because it is something that he's trying to capture, because it is a thing. But I think he's trying to figure out, like, how do I represent this? Because it is something different than the normal sort of layers that we talk about. But, what that layer should be, or what that naming should be, is still a little bit up in the air. So anyways, hope everybody's doing well. Hope you've had a good Sunday or a good week, or staying healthy and safe and getting ready for holiday season, and maybe spending some time with your family, or going to trade shows, whatever it might be, whatever you got coming up here in sort of the fourth quarter of the year. Unbelievable how fast the year's gone by. But anyways, thanks for listening. If you get a chance, please go out to Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Give us a ranking, give us a rating, give us 5 stars if you like the show. We'd love it. Give us some feedback. That'd be awesome too. But thanks again for telling a friend. Thanks for helping us grow the show, helping us grow the community, and sending us your feedback on what you want to hear next. So with that, I'll wrap it up. I'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.